So good afternoon and welcome to the 2014 Stendahl Symposium. We're really glad you could make it. I'm Michael Woolf. I'm the Harvard Divinity School Student Association Coordinator for Academics. And I had the great pleasure of helping to plan this symposium. And I think I've got a real treat for you today, to be honest. I think I read so many interesting papers and so much great work. And all these presenters tackle the theme of conversations across religious boundaries in their own way. They come at it from several different angles, and I think it's going to be a real pleasure. But first, a brief word about the symposium and who it's in honor of, Christopher Stendahl. In the spring of 2008, there was a student initiative that was really looking for a way to highlight student work at Harvard Divinity School, for a way to really showcase all the really interesting stuff that our student body gets to work on, and gain the scholarly experience of presenting to peers, all sorts of stuff. And at the same time, we happen to lose someone really important to our school, Christopher Stendahl. And so the decision was made to kind of wrap that together, to give a way for our wonderful students to present their work, and to also highlight the memory of Christopher Stendahl. And I have a little handout that has a little bit about him on it, but I wanted to say a little bit about him. Christopher Stendahl was the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of Divinity Emeritus, was the Dean of the Faculty of Divinity at Harvard from 1968 to 1979. In the late 1980s, he returned to HDS as its first chaplain. In many ways, he built this house. It's the house that Christopher Stendahl built in many ways, because I've personally been on the receiving end of this unique place as Harvard Divinity School and preparing for ministry actually in a pluralist kind of environment. And certainly shaped me in ways that I didn't expect when I came here. And it's certainly changed how I approach ministry, and I owe that a lot probably to the legacy of Christopher Stendahl. The direction and scope of our MTS was directly shaped by him, and our practices at the religious and spiritual life and student life were shaped by his presence. And so I think it's hard to go 3 or 2 years at Harvard Divinity School without running into Christopher Stendahl, whether we know it or not. And so the students here are shaped by his presence, even amongst us now, and how he shaped this program and how he shaped the school. So, like I said, there's a little bit more about him on the handout that I printed out, but I think it's key to point out how he thought about these conversations that we're about to have, how he thought about these conversations across faith lines. For interfaith dialogue, Stendahl laid out 3 really essential principles that I think are worth discussing. First, he said that it's important to let the other define herself, and to don't think you know the other without listening. And secondly, he said that we have to compare equal to equal and not have positive qualities that we're comparing versus the negative qualities of someone whose tradition we don't share. And the third, we have to find beauty in the other so as to develop holy envy, is what he said. And so today we pay tribute to the work of Stendahl and his ongoing influence on our school by highlighting some work that our wonderful presenters have done that carries on that legacy, that is about conversations across religious boundaries. Like I said, come at it from a lot of different angles, but I think it's going to be really great. And so, without further ado, our first paper comes from Molly Moses. And Molly is a first-year MTS student in religion and the social sciences with a background in folklore and mythology. Originally from Baltimore, she had her first interfaith encounter-inspired theological crisis in Minnesota at the age of 16. Her interests include doubt, language, and meaning in prayer, relativism, and learning more math in order to make better spatial analogies. So please help me welcome Molly.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you all. I'll get started. The phenomenological method, anthropologist Michael D. Jackson writes in Things as They Are, involves placing in brackets or setting aside questions concerning the rational, ontological, or objective status of ideas and beliefs in order to fully describe and do justice to the ways in which people actually live, experience, and use them, the ways in which they appear to consciousness." End quote. At the same time, the question of ontological status might be a central concern of those with whom an anthropologist engages. How can a person who suspends the pursuit of fundamental truth do justice to the experience of those who base their lives upon a necessary correspondence between dogmatic belief and objective reality? In this paper, I describe how respectful existential phenomenological anthropology avoids relativism and pragmatism, as well as cultural hegemony, by acknowledging and detailing these very differences in the ways people perceive of and care about truth. Existential phenomenological anthropology seeks to explore life as experienced rather than as externally conceptualized and judged. Following in the tradition of philosophers such as Feuerbach and Nietzsche, who made humans, not God, the rightful and perhaps the only real subject of investigation, anthropologists in this vein resist imposing categories such as the good from without. Against the backdrop of anthropology's own complicated history, they seek to avoid what Jackson calls invoking cultural privilege as a foundation for evaluating worldviews or examining the complex and enigmatic character of the human condition, end quote. Instead of engaging in such presumptive or even arrogant evaluation, where one party must be correct and all others incorrect, they investigate, and I quote, "the ways in which we construct, contest, and experience our worlds." This investigation seems to entail a suspension of the pursuit of metaphysics. Subjective is the new objective. As T.M. Lerman says in her introduction to When God Talks Back, an investigation into the lived evangelical experience of God, and I quote, "Anthropologists want to understand how people interpret their world before, or I would add, rather than, passing judgment on whether their interpretation is right or wrong, and so I will not presume to know ultimate reality." End quote. The anthropological endeavor is, at its best, however, a form of real interpersonal encounter. When undertaken with appropriate gravitas and respect, it may entail unsettling one's own noumenal claims, as well as those of one's correspondents. Our conceptions of reality are rooted deeply in ourselves, in our bodies. As a result, working to understand another person is not merely an intellectual task. As Dr. Jackson writes in Life Worlds, it involves physical upheaval, psychological turmoil, and moral confusion, end quote. Without implying that we should preserve a marketplace of ideals for our own privilege and benefit, I say that in coming to know another consciousness, another way of being and seeing, we increase an appreciation for the diversity found within human experience. We may feel the richer for the new perspective and less solitary. There is comfort and companionship in knowing that we, as individuals or even as societies, are not alone here, that other awarenesses keep us company in this reality. Yet this awareness of other awarenesses, Jackson notes, results in, and I quote, "loss of the illusion that one's own particular worldview holds true for everyone," end quote. The full discovery of another, in a way, can prompt or even necessitate, quote, "the invalidation of oneself." There is both pain and joy when a person comes to the realization that her own mind, existence, and truth matter no more and no less than anyone else's. In describing one potential result of intersubjective awareness, the late philosopher Richard Rorty speaks of irony, as he says, "I use ironist to name the sort of person who faces up to the contingency of his or her own most central beliefs and desires, someone sufficiently historicist and nominalist to have abandoned the idea that those central beliefs and desires refer back to something beyond the reach of time and space and chance." End quote. When an anthropologist gives up her right to rightness, whether temporarily or permanently, in the fight against cultural, political, and religious oppression, she must keep in mind that the people with whom she engages may or may not be taking the same leap of non-faith. Within a single community, and sometimes within a single individual, skeptical, ironic, constructivist, and relativist outlooks coexist or alternate with outlooks that rely upon correspondence between universal, personal, and objective truth. Even though the products of intellectual reflection are not the primary focus of existential phenomenological anthropology, many people do struggle with their role in the world along such lines. This very distinction in outlook between those who make their own meaning and those who see themselves as discovering the meaning, the truth that already exists, is crucial to understanding, as Jackson phrases it, how a person inhabits and experiences his or her being in the world. While a pragmatist, such as William James, says that a serious argument should demonstrate some practical difference that must follow from one side or the other's being right, the differences that appear regarding the realm of the impractical, even of the imperceptible, are exactly the most serious ones for a believer in truth beyond our empirical ken. A pragmatic orientation does not heed some people's deeply felt, existentially felt, conviction that the truth of the transcendent matters, that it must matter, even if this world could be explained and inhabited without reference to that truth. Ignoring the importance of this conviction to those who hold it is both a methodological and an ethical issue within ethnography. In taking such a division into account, existential phenomenological anthropology essentially doubles upon a debate from within its own intellectual history, probing the divergence in outlook from which it took its mission and practice. A sensitive anthropologist focuses on description rather than prescription, including description of how individuals might be working to adhere to prescriptive, dogmatic creedal systems and assert their participation in the norm. In so doing, the anthropologist can bring to light the crucial diversity in life world that exists within a community between people who did and did not, so to speak, get with the postmodern times. Even those who pray in the same room with the same words and melody may be having a variety of experiences based on how they map themselves to their language and their communities, and each of these things to whatever may or may not be out there. These experiences may change on a daily basis on the level of the individual. As Lerman points out, belief is not an either-or choice, and even a good Christian may not have a straightforward commitment to God's reality. This variety is one that doubters, skeptics, and believers alike may find confusing or downright traumatic. In fact, I have found in both interfaith and intrafaith settings that the moments that provoke the most argument and crisis regard questions of approach to and implications of truth, not questions of truth's content. By illuminating the individual's lived experience, existential phenomenological anthropology opens space to discuss these differences within and similarities across what can seem to be monolithic, distinct religious systems. The need to investigate lived religious belief and practice along a different cross-section than the one usually privileged in interfaith dialogue came to my attention this past June, when I participated in a week-long seminar at Union Theological Seminary called Religious Truth. Facilitated by Professor John Thatomenal of the host seminary and Dr. Alon Goshen-Gottstein of the Elijah Interfaith Institute, the course provided an opportunity for Jewish and Christian seminarians, Divinity School students, and ordained persons to gather and discuss questions including, how do I view religious truth? What, if any, is the problem I find with it? And how do I understand truth in the framework of interreligious relations? In discussing various types of truth, orthodoxy versus orthopraxy, and what one of our leaders termed the double-edged sword of central authority, we investigated how truth figures in our view of other religions. 3 models came to light. First, that truth is not that important, and all of the quotations are from my personal class notes. Second, that we all have truth, or we all have limited truth. And third, that none of us have truth. Discussing truth in an interreligious context helped foster understanding between Jews and Christians, and highlighted the ways in which our truths interact with and affect each other. At the same time, I found that the largest division in the room was not between religious traditions writ large, but rather between those who claimed or needed ontological truth to cement their own religious practices and affiliations, and those who justified participation in their religious traditions and symbol sets in other ways. As an example of the latter, Dr. Judith Plaskow, a constructive feminist Jewish theologian who gave a guest lecture during the week, told us that Judaism for her is not a matter of truth, but rather of meaningfulness. In her words, though myths may not be true in a propositional sense, they give us a map for the universe. In our discussions of truth, revelation, and meaning, it was intra-religiously, not inter-religiously, that we came across the same potentially uncrossable rifts in outlook as did our theological forebears, including Abraham Joshua Heschel and Martin Buber. As Edward Kaplan relates in Sacred versus Symbolic Religion, and I quote, "For Heschel, Buber's acquiescence to symbolism imperils the acknowledgement of God as an objective reality," end quote. There was no unified religious front that either group of students was able to present to the other. We used the same languages, but even our shared terms indexed different planes of existence. The following dialogues and contradictory remarks were emblematic of the debate that simmered throughout the week. Why should a person be part of a confessional religion if it is just a limited part of the full picture? A response: to engage with these realities is a very, very concrete thing. You have to invest yourself, put on the clothing of a religious life. Another: what is authoritative given the question that the person who is being responded to has raised? Authority is something we bestow upon that which we claim to be authoritative. Responding to that: doesn't that then make oneself the authority? Responding: fine, to put it shortly, but there are reasons you choose to submit to what you take to be authoritative. This gives you responsibility for that choice. This conversation is predicated on I, so-and-so, can say or get to choose what works for me. Someone asks, is truth relative then? Response: truth is contextual. Nothing is true unless it is involved in an actual engagement. And lastly, and this is a quote from Judith Plaskow, if there is no absolute foundation to our beliefs and practices, how and where do we ground ourselves? I learned that interfaith dialogue, like anthropological discourse and investigation, needs to pay attention to the how, the why, and the when, as well as the what of belief, in order to avoid overlooking existence of difference in the ways that people orient themselves to what they put forward as their religious systems, their points of view. Highlighting this need was the fact that our teachers themselves, who by being Jewish and Christian ostensibly represented the most salient division present in the classroom, both often espoused what I would consider to be liberal religious viewpoints. In some ways, they treated as obvious our participation in these viewpoints, given our intellectual and historical positioning. Professor Thatomanal reminded us on the first day that everyone in this room is reading pre-Enlightenment texts from a post-Enlightenment perspective, while Dr. Goshen-Gottstein frankly quoted, "We have all been born into modernity. We have lost our innocence." I want to pursue further the ways in which the concepts of innocence and knowledge, childish theology and mature theology, contain a value judgment regarding ontological assertions. The distinction seems similar to that which used to lead anthropologists to speak of primitive societies and modern societies. How do people use these oppositions when narrating their own religious development in intrafaith and interfaith conversations? And what implications does this narrative have for those whose religious journey does not involve a so-called maturation in their views of religious truth? In general, I hope to engage in and see more research on the role that people's orientation toward big T truth plays in how interfaith dialogue, particularly on controversial topics, might unfold.
Thank you so much, Molly. Our next paper comes from Katelynn E. Carver, and Katelynn studies the intersection of process metaphysics, spirituality, literature, and neuropsychology, focusing on narrative and its significance in meaning-making. She serves as a managing editor for Cult and Culture, Harvard Divinity School's Journal of Graduate Research. She's a signing member of the European Society for Process Thought, and she currently works as an academic consultant for international students studying in Hong Kong. She will receive her Master of Theological Studies from HDS in May and will be embarking upon her doctoral research in Europe this fall. Help me welcome Katelynn.
Thank you. There is a home video of me as a young child, and I hadn't yet celebrated my second birthday, but I am telling a story about a tree in my front yard in Cleveland. And I'm dancing around the tree, and I'm petting my dog, and I'm telling the camera that the tree is mine, and it grows because I love it. It's a simple story, obviously, but it predates even my earliest unaided recollections. And so before I can even rightly remember, I was telling stories. And to me, that grainy piece of VHS tape stands as a tangible testament to the inherent and timeless power of narrative within human experience at large. So this fundamental innateness of storytelling is a testament to the foundational human need to connect and bear witness to one's experience within a relational setting. Regardless of its context, the process of narrative meaning-making is primarily one of integration, in which a story emerges and is shared as a product of the dynamic interweaving of the personal with the public, the transient with the enduring, the finite with the infinite. This dynamic and creative commingling, in turn, yields the essential meaning that drives both individual lives and human societies at large toward advancement and development. The foundational embeddedness of meaning-making via this telling of stories is underscored in practice by the fact that while storytelling is employed across various contexts and is driven by disparate forces respectively, it is nevertheless consistently and almost universally understood to ultimately function in the interest of conveying meaning within the relational sharing of experience. In seeking to properly recognize this universally relevant phenomenological underpinning of storytelling, beyond the particulars of context, the comparison of the secular, or the anthropological, and the monastic hermeneutic lenses as applied to the process of narrative exchange provides a particularly poignant and reasonably representative example of differing relational contexts for storytelling that, ultimately, do seek to achieve the same end of meaning derivation. Perhaps the most immediately obvious divergence between these two models of storytelling involves the source to which each attributes the core inspiration for narrativity. When secular models are inclined to attribute the storytelling drive towards something innately human, and likewise to identify the object of narrative meaning-making as the enrichment of human existence for its own sake, traditional religious models tend to credit the grace of an ultimate reality for the blessed capacity for storytelling, which is to then be subsequently utilized toward the glory of a generally transcendently conceptualized divine being. For instance, where Thomas Merton, a Cistercian monk, attributes his own authorial gifts to the grace and will of a Christian God, the poet Charles Bukowski interprets this through a more secular and human-driven lens, describing storytelling as a birthright that is deeply intertwined with one's essential humanness, a quintessentially human drive that, quote, comes bursting out of you in spite of everything, comes unasked out of your heart and your mind and your mouth and your gut, comes out of your soul like a rocket, unquote, convincing you, quote, that being still would drive you to madness or suicide or murder, and it persists until you die or it dies in you. This interpretive schism is further compounded by the more significant issue of how each model addresses the central social relational aspect of meaning-making and storytelling. Monastic approaches have commonly struggled with the disconnect between communal sharing and traditional vows of silence and or isolation that typify many traditions of religious cloistering, where secular models are laden with the image of the author as an observer, as functionally removed in a similar manner, yet with dissimilar motives, individual instead of ecclesiastic. Given that the similarities between these two modes of narrative meaning-making are so often presented with such convolution as to appear as discrepancies rather than forms of similarity, one might be inclined to suggest that they are largely irreconcilable as mechanisms for meaning derivation and are actually examples of two essentially different modes of communicating and meaning-making, regardless of where they overlap, one oriented toward the transcendent and the other toward the immanent. On the contrary, however, I propose that these two models, as a direct result of their differing motivations and objectives, serve to demonstrate the universality of storytelling as an instrument for creating meaning within relationship. For the primary point of diversion between them is more terminological than it is functional. Whether the impetus for storytelling is a god of transcendent power in Merton's case, or if it's the creative impulse itself, as Bukowski understands it, the ultimate result of the creative endeavor is the same. Meaning-making is done. Thus, once the discrepancies of vernacular are addressed, it becomes clear that both models operate in very similar ways, creating meaning within relationship, despite the fact that their driving forces and ultimate aims are comprehended differently within their different contexts. With this ultimate similarity in mind, one of the most prominent barriers in reconciling secular and religious modes of storytelling, and thus meaning-making within relationship, indeed emerges as being linguistic in nature. While the terminology employed to describe phenomena in each model may at first appear contradictory, further analysis reveals deep connections across the spectrum of religiosity and secularity with regard to the centrality of relationship to the overarching narrative enterprise. Classical monastic concepts, such as isolation, cloistering, and contemptus mundi, can at first seem antithetical to relationality, but further contextualization reveals how these ideas operate socially and can be reconciled with a communal model of meaning-making through storytelling. Secularly, child psychologist Bruno Bettelheim asserts that, quote, to find deeper meaning, one must be able to transcend the narrow confines of a self-centered existence, unquote. For, as anthropologist Michael D. Jackson notes, quote, no life is sufficient unto itself. Our lives belong to others as well as to ourselves, end quote. Similarly, within a monastic framework, Merton asserts that, quote, the spiritual life is first of all a life, end quote. An existence that is not static, theoretical, or compartmentalized, but instead highly experiential and interrelational. The distinction in Merton's case, however, is that such a life be simultaneously rooted fully in prayer and the will of God. In such cases, analogous sentiments are ultimately being expressed, yet the linguistic choices and tradition-specific caveats found in the Mertonian example can intervene to muddy the parallels. For example, the archetypal monastic attitude of contemptus mundi can be reframed as promoting a degree of isolation in the interest of better cultivating selfhood. In moderation, this approach can function meaningfully within a narrative social model of meaning derivation. Periods of isolation and meditative internalization often yield valuable insights that can be applied to create more fruitful narratives within a collective human ethos. Here, the process theological principle of meaning and significance as derived from the dynamic experiences of contrast, such as withdrawal paired with return, can be applied to the withdrawal of the monk from the world as a means of fostering novel insight. To this end, Merton eventually concluded that the, quote, depths of solitude are in every human person, unquote, and not merely in isolation, thus establishing the precedent that experience in isolation can be meaningfully shared in relationship because the capacity for solitudinous experience and revelation exists within and is relevant to all. Such isolation from the larger world can likewise be viewed as a means of developing the authorial voice. The very selfhood of the storyteller that necessarily colors the story being told and likewise shapes those who hear it. Hannah Arendt presents storytelling as an aspect of the interplay between public and private. Invoking the process understanding of contrast, this interplay is in itself a relationship. Storytelling necessarily involves the private, individual, and sometimes isolated self, that then enters into more public communion with others. Thus, where Merton came to realize that, quote, in order to belong to God, I have to belong to myself, unquote, a less ecclesiastically specific extension of this truth can be found once more in Bukowski. Quote, if you have to first read it to your wife, or your girlfriend, or your boyfriend, or your parents, or to anybody at all, you're not ready, unquote. One's selfhood, and by extension one's authorial voice, must be affirmed internally before the interrelational process of storytelling can be most fulfillingly engaged. As Merton observes, many artists and storytellers, quote, waste their years in vain efforts to be some other poet, some other saint, unquote. Isolation, then, can provide an opportunity to shape the relational self in preparation for the external sharing of narrative in ways that will uniquely enrich both the self that interacts and the others through storytelling who are interacting with the story itself. In this spirit, Merton asserts that, quote, true contemptus mundi is rather a compassion for the transient world, unquote, therefore rendering true solitude as a, quote, deep awareness of the world's needs. It does not hold the world at arm's length, unquote. This perspective, then, successfully highlights the primacy of relationship to storytelling as meaning-making within a monastic framework. Much like Joseph Campbell's heroic monomyth, in which the hero departs from the known in accepting a call to adventure, yet must return to share the boons of their experience with others in order to complete the journey, so long as solitude is coupled with relational sharing, the meaning derived from storytelling can in fact be enhanced through time spent in isolation. Thus, when one steps back from direct relationship with the intention of reconnecting with the world in some way at some point, as Merton did, the encounter with isolation and temporary lack of explicit connection can reveal intimate truths that will only enrich the narrative that is eventually shared in relationship. In more secular language, writer and director Ingmar Bergman conveys the creative paradox. Quote, here in my solitude, I have the feeling that I contain too much humanity. It oozes out of me like a broken tube of toothpaste. It doesn't want to stay within the confines of my body. A strange feeling of weight and volume, soul volume, perhaps, unquote. In response to such supersaturation of feeling, Bergman created for audiences, sharing his revelations from solitude, a secular contemptus mundi that kept the world at arm's length for a time, but kept the arm outreached so as to retrieve the world and share the boon, the soul volume, that when offered in relationship through stories, possesses the power to transform both the storyteller and the audience alike. In thus identifying the operative divergence between Hermetic and secular models of narrative meaning-making as being a matter of linguistic semantics, a word of caution is justified. The very act of storytelling inherently implies that the audience is exterior to the author, and they are whom the author needs to translate the authorial experiences into meaningful language so as it can be understood and engaged in dialogue to create meaning. To this end, Merton was keenly aware of the fact that language was often twisted by presumption and facade, and cautioned against, quote, the betrayal of our deep self that sometimes takes place in our effort to communicate with others exteriorly, end quote. In order to assuage this tension of whether the very interrelational imperative of storytelling poses a genuine threat to the selfhood that embarks upon narrativity, an alternative view is necessary, one that frames such a translation of experience into fallible human language within a context of trust, rather than a context of susceptibility. In giving voice to our stories in words, ill-fitting and partially accurate, though they may sometimes be, a deep faith is invested in our listeners to understand, accept, and participate in our unique realm of experience, however momentarily and to whatever limited extent. We place an incredible confidence in the universality of some archetypal truths that will be understood, that transcend language and reside within, beneath, beyond the literal definitions of the vocabulary used to touch something deeper, something profoundly and inextricably human that ties us to some larger pseudo-Jungian collective unconsciousness. It is, in this sense, both a gambit of language and an undeniable act of faith, within or outside a traditionally theological context, that is embodied in the trusting of one's fellows to fill in the gaps when we attempt to touch upon extra-linguistic essence of human experience in order to evoke meaning through the sharing of stories. This trust in humankind is conveyed in storytelling, can also be considered, by extension, as an exhibition of faith in God as the divine present within creation, thus imbuing storytelling with the potential of being a religiously significant practice aligned with the glory and pursued within the grace of God. More secularly, one might aim to root one's linguistic choices in the shared story of humanity and be willing to act on faith that the narrative that precedes us will resonate where words fall short. Campbell's thoroughly known labyrinth that has been walked by all who came before, and that allows us to greet communion in the unnameable, for, quote, where we had thought to be alone, we shall be with all the world, unquote. Therefore, in both cases, relationality, the trust that typifies and is built within genuine relationship, is what allows us to tell our stories and gives us the opportunities to create significance. This in turn speaks to the larger commonality of meaning-making through the sharing of narrative both in secular and religious contexts, regardless of their sources of inspiration or overarching goals. While the colloquialism is ubiquitous that the significance of the journey surpasses that of the destination, Within the context of storytelling, the process is more meaningful than either the endpoint or the origin. Whether aimed toward the glory of humankind or God, whether they are divinely inspired or expressions of a deeply human nature, whether they are born from isolation or can be expressed with any objective accuracy in the languages we possess, human beings have a predisposition toward forming stories and sharing them in relationship. We may not literally be the stories that we tell, but we certainly internalize them, embody them in some critical way as we perpetuate them. They form the culture that in turn forms us, and though our stories are not quite the clay from which we are shaped, they are certainly among the hands that lend their touch to the process of molding. Thus, whether we become images of the divine as we tell stories as expressions of religious devotion, or we offer our accounts simply because we are human and feel innately compelled to weave our experiences into narrative, the process either way is ultimately relational, ultimately told to something or someone, ultimately translated in the sharing and added to the larger enduring narrative of a species of believers in a God and in humankind alike. The practice of storytelling in this way reasserts a path for others to learn from and follow, the Ariadne threads leading us from the labyrinths cobbled through language and offered in relationship. Thus, the oft-apparent divide between religious and secular conceptualizations of the narrative process is, at least in some sense, reconciled in that regardless of the intent or the inspiration, meaning is derived from storytelling in relationship either way. It is therefore not essential to distinguish polarities or draw false dichotomies between secularity and religiosity when it comes to the meaning evoked by storytelling. The primary significance is, instead, the ways in which we make our meaning within narrative, the interplay that takes place and thrives and endures regardless of the contextual sphere in which it moves, but in which we find our purpose, our meaning, not in the start itself, nor in the finish, but instead within the telling.
Thank you for that paper. Our next paper comes from Meghan Guidry. And Meghan's in her second year at Harvard Divinity School, where she studies religion, philosophy, politics, and social sciences. Her work focuses primarily on bioethics and how religious imaginaries and communities interact with biomedicine and health policy in the public sphere. Let's welcome Meghan.
When Proposition 2, also known as the Death with Dignity Initiative, was introduced by Michael Clark via petition on August 2nd, 2011, for consideration in the next Massachusetts election, it seemed as though the bill would pass innocuously, almost unceremoniously. In the months leading to the election, a focused campaign was launched to defeat Proposition 2. At its core, this campaign was directed by the Catholic Church and funded through a network of Catholic-affiliated charities that were able to raise nearly $5 million in the span of a few short months. The campaign, though, was designed to reach beyond just a core voting bloc of concerned Catholics and represented a local and contemporary example of theologically motivated cause building support through the conscientious deployment of a decidedly secular campaign language. And it worked. On November 6, 2012, Proposition 2 was narrowly defeated by a 51 to 49% vote. This paper explores that campaign to better understand the strategies employed by the Catholic Church and uses the campaign to defeat Proposition 2 as a case study in communications across religious divides. To do this, we must piece together a story scattered across numerous public spheres. By examining alliances made between the Catholic Church and other organizations and the writings officials use to mobilize voting bases, we can examine how both the sacred and the secular mobilized to defeat Proposition 2. In the aftermath of the election, many newscasters and political commentators were quick to attribute the measure's defeat to a high turnout of concerned Catholic voters. However, that conjecture greatly simplified the actual mechanics and some might say the overall success of the campaign. A high Catholic population, while an important factor, is far from the only one that determined the ballot's defeat. Remarkably, the campaign was actually crafted to de-emphasize the religious objections to physician-assisted suicide in order to reach a wider voting base. And while numerous faith traditions hold that suicide, even in instances of terminal illness for the alleviation of suffering, is morally unacceptable, the centralized structure of the Catholic Church allowed the Church to more effectively and strategically form alliances with non-religious organizations in order to disseminate its message to the voting public, in order to fully understand measures taken by the campaign against Proposition 2, we must explore the actual text of the measure. In the text, we will see the language that becomes employed by the Church in their counter-campaign. Section 1 of the initiative petition reads, "It is hereby declared that the public welfare requires a defined and safeguarded process by which an adult Massachusetts resident who has the capacity to make healthcare decisions and who has been determined by his or her attending and consulting physicians to be suffering from a terminal disease that will cause death within 6 months may obtain medication that the patient may self-administer to end his or her life in a humane and dignified manner. It is further declared that the public welfare requires that such a process be entirely voluntary on the part of all participants, including the patient, his or her physicians, and any other healthcare provider or facility providing services or care to the patient." Within the very language of this petition, we find 2 primary points that the Church used in its campaign to encourage voters to take action against the measure: the conceptualization of the word dignity and the question of the voluntariness of physician-assisted suicide in social and medical practice. While the Church's interpretation of these 2 issues will become the crux of its campaign, it is important to understand the details of what would be allowed under the petition in order to assess the campaign strategies employed against it. The crux of the secular language the Catholic Church would use in its campaign was actually drawn from this text itself. The measure's words were integral in 2 major communication strategies directed toward both the laity and members of the general public who might have been wavering or undecided in their vote. The Church focused campaign media and materials on the definition of dignity expressed in the text. While theologically, suicide and dignity are irreconcilable according to Catholic doctrine, campaign media challenged the measure's conception of dignity by appealing to broad ethical concerns not attached to a specific theology. Though deeply rooted in religious ideologies, the campaign messages were conveyed as secular and focused on the dignity of life for all individuals in all conditions of health, a dignity that would be threatened should a life's worth be subject to such a law. Additionally, the campaign focused on just how voluntary the measure would be in practice for vulnerable populations, such as those who are disabled, impoverished, or the elderly. This focus led to the creation of a line that would reappear throughout the campaign, quote, "that question 2 is poorly written, confusing, and flawed." This one phrase would characterize the methodology of the campaign: to publicize the case against Proposition 2 while minimizing the religious dimensions behind it in order to attract the largest possible supporter base to vote down the measure. The Church partnered with numerous organizations in order to expand the reach of its message to individuals and groups outside of the Catholic community and voting bloc, and to rely on other organizations that were ideologically affiliated regarding Proposition 2 to bring the campaign to a wider audience. In a statement released after the announcement of the defeat of Proposition 2, Cardinal Sean O'Malley of Massachusetts said, quote, "The campaign against physician-assisted suicide brought together a diverse coalition from medical, disability rights, and interfaith communities, all dedicated to ensuring that our residents were well informed about this issue." It was these strategic alliances that assured the campaign against Proposition 2 reached the widest possible audience prior to the election. These alliances were made with individuals and groups that were aligned with the Church ideologically on this one issue of physician-assisted suicide, but who were not overly Catholic or even religious in their public presentation. One of these individuals was Roseanne Bacon Mead, the former president of the Massachusetts Teachers Association. She was appointed to head the Committee Against Physician-Assisted Suicide just months before the election. Mead's background as a teacher, a professor, a community leader, and a progressive activist brought a non-religious voice to the issue, In statements made to the press upon the announcement of her appointment, Mead avoided making any declarations against Proposition 2 on religious grounds. She simply stated, quote, "No matter your philosophical views on end-of-life decision-making, the initiative petition is poorly written, confusing, and flawed. With Massachusetts as the center of modern medical advances and treatment for those who are seriously ill, we can do better than pass a ballot question that would take us backward, not forward, in how we deal with end-of-life care," end quote. Here we see Mead repeating that phrase, poorly written, confusing, and flawed, which is vitally important because it highlights how the language deployed through the campaign materials focused on making the question of physician-assisted suicide a non-religious issue through its presentation to the general public. Mead quickly rallied doctors, physicians groups, and hospice groups as supporters for the campaign. A quote from Dr. Alexandra Sist, a physician, ethics consultant at Mass General Hospital, and a professor here at Harvard Medical School, became a standard feature in articles released by the campaign. Quote, "Patients don't need to commit suicide to achieve peace and dignity. Instead, they need better advanced care planning and increased early entry into palliative care and hospice so a patient can benefit profoundly from the right treatment and support." Through Mead, the campaign's alliance with medical professionals reframed the fight against Proposition 2 to be about the idea of dignified treatment during the dying process, a term that could easily cross religious, social, and political lines. Another powerful alliance the Catholic Church forged was with Second Thoughts, a disability rights group. Second Thoughts proved to be a powerful ally because their core mission extended beyond the defeat of Proposition 2 and into an exploration of how health policy affects those with disabilities. Second Thoughts, quote, "seeks to move the context of the assisted suicide debate beyond simplified political divisions," end quote, and, quote, "encourages voters to look at assisted suicide in the real world, where insurance companies and other organizations try to limit spending on health care, where disabled people face discrimination through architectural barriers and unemployment while lacking in-home services to enable them to integrate into communities," end quote. Second Thoughts both highlighted the potential complications of Proposition 2 and further problematized the word dignity within a context of the able-bodied ascribing their notions of dignity onto those with physical disabilities. Director John Kelly stated, quote, "The idea of providing dignity through death holds dangerous implications for society, and particularly for people with disabilities. The word dignity, which is never defined, we know that it generally means someone who is not autonomous in their self-care, someone who does not need someone else to care for them. When society makes a law based on one group of people's notion of dignity, it will discriminate against people in that society whose lives look like the lives that are being rejected under the bill," end quote. Kelly added another dimension to the term dignity by arguing that its definition in the initiative privileged the able-bodied and by implying a slippery slope argument for the disabled community whose physical challenges could appear as the quote-unquote undignified state of living that people would want to avoid should physician-assisted suicide be legalized. Such a perception would jeopardize the livelihood and safety of disabled individuals. The full-scale campaign did not launch until shortly before the election, and most of the publicly visible campaign activity occurred only between the months of August and November of 2012. By that time, the campaign was already designed to address the Catholic laity through religious channels such as the Boston Pilot, and to attract non-Catholic supporters through appearances in other media. Paramount to reaching those voters not affiliated with the church was the accusation that the measure was poorly written, confusing, and flawed. While this phrase appears on nearly every document and statement issued by the campaign, it is an objective not rooted in a theological doctrine. It is a critique of the language of the proposed law, and its repetition throughout the campaign is effective in two crucial ways. One, it invited non-Catholic voters to join a cause that they may have otherwise been reticent to side with, given the prominent role of the Catholic Church in the campaign. Siding with the church on ideological and body issues may have been unappealing for voters who might agree with the eventual decision being proposed, but not with the ideological backing or with other stances on body issues taken by church leaders. Secondly, the poorly written, confusing, and flawed accusation became capable of rallying individuals across professional lines. By problematizing the text of the measure as a potential legal, medical, and political issue in practice, if passed, the church made Proposition 2 more relevant to professional groups who, while they might favor physician-assisted suicide as a matter of individual freedom, would be reluctant to vote for it due to the implications its passing would have on their professional lives and communities. Cardinal O'Malley also worked to engage the laity. In the summer leading to the election, quote, Cardinal O'Malley kept a regular stream of columns going in the Pilot, end quote. Yet even within Catholic media, the Cardinal's messages were designed to reach beyond religious boundaries. In a Pilot article called The Slippery Slope of Assisted Suicide, O'Malley outlined a number of his concerns and points of contention. Before outlining them, he urged, quote, please judge for yourself whether you agree with the risk that one or all of these concerns might occur in Massachusetts if we took the first step this election day by voting to legalize assisted suicide, end quote. O'Malley then outlines the following risks associated with Proposition 2, quote, it could lead to increased elder abuse, it could lead to the adoption of quality of life standards, it could lead to a lower level of care, it could undermine the doctor-patient relationship, it could lead to a devaluing of human life, end quote. Even in a prominent Catholic news outlet directed towards a Catholic readership, O'Malley continued to reinforce his concerns in a language of secular ethics by appealing to concern for professional effectiveness and the value of human life. Simultaneously, Second Thoughts director John Kelly voiced concerns that echoed Catholic social teachings and which drew on non-religious concerns regarding patient care. Kelly stated, quote, it is dangerous for people who are already disadvantaged in terms of getting adequate medical care and full social respect. It is very dangerous for a society with such great levels of inequality, end quote. Kelly ties Proposition 2 also to economic equality as well as disability rights. In subsequent statements, he expressed a fear that patients would doctor shop in order to end their lives. He made no mention of the numerous safeguards in the measure designed to prevent this conduct. The goal here was not to debate the initiative line by line. Kelly was working towards the campaign's predominant strategy of constructing a voting base from a variety of demographics to defeat the measure. However, we must not let the diminished religious language of the campaign lead us to think that this defeat was entirely unrelated to religion. Indeed, the centralized structure of the Catholic Church itself facilitated the fundraising, strategy development, and media campaigns that were integral to their success. It is worth noting here that while the campaign was successful, it was not a, quote, model victory by analyst standards, and other dioceses facing similar measures in their home states have heavily adapted this campaign strategy to avoid some of the missteps the Boston Archdiocese was perceived to have taken. The story of the campaign that defeated Proposition 2 just over 2 years ago is a complex blend of politics, alliances, and religion that unified to effect significant change in the public sphere. While the initial fodder against the prospect of Massachusetts legalizing physician-assisted suicide came from the church, the campaign coalitions, documents, and demographics revealed that the ultimate success of the campaign was not drawn solely along religious lines. The financial thrust of the campaign was shouldered by the Catholic Church, Church's primary institutions, but the campaign itself was designed to be fluid across religious lines, to fuse a disjointed constituency into a majority voting bloc. If there are any lessons to be taken from Proposition 2's story, the main one is a tale for all sides about the power of narrative. While the Catholic Church clearly drove the anti-Proposition 2 campaign, the initiative was voted down along lines much more nuanced and complex than solely religious affiliation. As we move into an era where the United States is testing government-supported health care for all citizens, and in which health care and health policy are increasingly cited as important political matters, these collisions of religion and politics will continue, if not increase. Our duty, then, is to understand how they interact so that we might work towards policies whereby a cohesive definition and application of dignity in a medical and religious context, particularly when facing the end of life, can be shared and accessed by all. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you to our three presenters. I think you'll agree that it's quite interesting, a lot to think about there. Next, we'll hear from a couple respondents, and our first respondent is Lucia Hulsether. Lucia is a third-year Master of Divinity candidate focusing on the cultural politics of religion in U.S. history. Her thesis investigated when, how, and why an institutional discourse of pluralism emerged at HDS. In the fall, Lucia will begin her doctoral work, although she has not decided where.
A week. It's great to be here. Thanks for your presentations. Can everybody hear me? Yeah? Okay, great. So since we're at a conference held in honor of the former HDS Dean Krister Stendahl, I hope it isn't too indulgent to begin with an anecdote about his life, which I think actually dramatizes the productive tension that exists among the fine papers that we've heard today. So Stendahl assumed his deanship just as anti-racist and anti-imperialist student movements were reaching their peak in this country and around the world. HDS was no exception, which didn't make things easy for Stendahl as he transitioned into his position in the bureaucracy. On one of his first days as dean, the Cambridge City Police showed up at his office door in order to present him with a warrant for the arrest of an AWOL U.S. Marine that students were harboring in Andover Chapel. The students insisted that their Christian faith demanded immediate confrontational action against the imperial war. Stendahl, who had come out against the war in public but was also trying to run the school, was in a predicament. He urged student activists to slow down, to embrace a kind of religious practice that emphasizes patience and meaning-making before any brash action. So as a pastor, professor, and dean during one of the more tumultuous periods in the school's history, Stendahl lived in the tensions about the role of religion as a force in the world, issues that dance in the background of the papers we have just heard. Is religion a matter of personal and community meaning-making, identity formation, and relationship? Is it more like a political and economic force which can be harnessed to build empires, fuel social movements, or, in the case of Megan's paper, defeat ballot initiatives? If religion as an object of inquiry has such divergent meanings and spawns such unwieldy subcategories of religious identity, how can we even begin to imagine interaction across religion's subjective locales? Both Molly and Katelynn adopt a phenomenological approach to the study of religion. Katelynn argues that humans have an essential need to tell stories, and that in fulfilling this need, they not only create meaning for their own lives and move beyond what she calls the narrow confines of self-centered existence, but also bridge divides between the religious and the secular. Molly calls on students of religion to suspend their judgment, to practice description rather than prescription when they encounter difference. And Megan draws our attention to how religion and politics interact as means to concrete ends, which may have bearing on how we live and how we die. These are rich projects, and our mere 90 minutes today cannot do them justice, but I'll raise 3 sets of themes and questions from which we may be able to start. My first question has to do with the tension between these approaches to the study of the religion and the ways that we approach difference, whether it be plurality of religious tradition or something else. Katelynn, you contend that in storytelling, the process is more meaningful than the endpoint or the origin, because it is the process that builds relationships. I wonder how far we would take this model. Does it apply to an electoral context like the one Megan outlines, where concrete ballot initiatives and issues of healthcare are on the line? when does normative judgment need to win out? Are these dialogues, these interactions that we often laud as good and valuable, whether they come in the form of storytelling, discussions about truth, or maybe dialogues about political strategy, when are they ends in themselves? What role do they serve, and where are they going? This leads me to my second question. Molly, you suggest that, quote, in both intra and interfaith settings, the moments that provoke the most argument and crisis regard questions of approach and implications, not questions of content in your experience. You suggest that students of religion should navigate this by adopting a descriptive rather than prescriptive approach to their subjects. And I'm curious to hear more about the distinction between these forms of engagement, particularly as it relates to your final point about constructing hierarchies of different kinds of subjects, human subjects in the dialogue. Might the vocabularies and the categories that we use to describe the beliefs and practices we note as significant, the legibility of something as an act that counts, as worth our attention, even how we imagine the self or the attempt to avoid judgment, might these things contain within them already as some kind of normative valence? If the goal is to foster empathy and identification, how can those engaged in such a descriptive process account for the power they hold in occupying the position to describe in the first place? As the differences between these papers, not to mention the history of religious studies as an enterprise, shows, even the ways that we choose to describe religion contains an implicitly prescriptive quality, I think. So the question of categories and the normative valences that they contain leads me to a third question. How do we understand the distinction between the religious and the secular, an opposition that is central and disrupted as well in two of our papers today? So numerous scholars, including Talal Asad, Saba Mahmood, Janet Jacobson, have, among others, have argued that we need to understand the relationship between the secular and the religious as discursive positions rather than discrete entities. And they make this move in order to disrupt an idea that there could be such thing as a universal secular that would contain all kinds of human action or all kinds of religion. So, Katelynn, you break this binary in your paper, but you do so in a different way by appealing to another universal, which is essential humanness. So I think that maybe in the discussion we can talk more about sort of what this essential humanness is, but for now I'm actually interested in another thing. I loved how you used the word secular as an adverb, secularly. This term raises a key question for me. How does one inhabit one's subject position secularly as opposed to religiously? And what can that distinction tell us if we're thinking about these categories as discourses that form their subjects? Meghan, interestingly, speaks to this issue exactly when she highlights the translation of what you call theology and at one time religious ideology into a secular political language. In this case, the Catholic Church campaign against Prop 2 comes to represent a sort of intrusion disguised as secular into a public political realm that we would like to think of as religiously neutral, but maybe isn't so neutral. How neutral is it? How neutral are our notions of what humanness is? In the United States, our political vocabularies, our economic systems, our socially and legally enshrined notions of human life and human dignity are quite shaped by a distinctly Protestant history and theology. So I wonder if we might understand something like Prop 2 and the campaign against it, not as an intrusion of one kind of religion into a secular realm, but instead as a struggle between two theological positions, one of which is understood to be more neutral than the other. Is it possible that better understanding the interaction between religion and politics, between the secular and the religious, between self and other, means collapsing or deconstructing the distinctions between them? I think the oppositions and value claims that wend their way into our seemingly neutral descriptive vocabularies pose problems for interreligious dialogue as an enterprise, a point that Molly emphasizes in her conclusion. It is very nice to valorize interreligious dialogue as a scenario in which people occupying various religious subject positions gather around a neutral table to discuss their beliefs and practices and values, or perhaps to pursue some mutually agreeable form of service. But Molly points to a tendency of interreligious exchanges to actually maybe carry out their own value judgments, to use your language, or create a hierarchy of subjects, where those who participate in the dialogue and give up their exclusive claims or question them gain the status of enlightened and modern, and those who don't may be dismissed as primitive or childish, or I would add, dangerous to a universal vision. I am very grateful that Molly has called us to reflexivity about our inner religious desires and projects and subject positions, especially in this institutional space in which such exchanges are often taken for granted as a self-evident good. We must be vigilant that our impulses around interreligious translation, mutual meaning-making, and exchange do not fall into the traps of false universals or glosses on issues of power and violence. In this presentation and response, drawing from the insights of these excellent papers, I have suggested that a commitment to such reflexivity would involve, first, close consideration of the ends to which our dialogues are oriented, a willingness to account for the prescriptive valences of our own descriptive endeavors, and a commitment to countering the normative suppositions and binaries inherent in our everyday vocabularies. But of course, these possibilities barely scratch the surface of what was offered by our panelists today. So again, I thank all of you for sharing your work, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you for that, Lucia. We have a second response, and our second response comes from the Reverend Janet Cooper Nelson, who is appointed at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, as chaplain of the university, where she also teaches at Alpert School of Medicine. She's engaged in several national initiatives focused on higher education, religious literacy, interfaith understanding, and medical ethics, especially end-of-life care, and maintains ready access to poetry, scriptures, and a quiet beach.
Thanks. First, I want to say thank you to all of you, and actually for this final paper. This was really a wonderful addition to this discourse. I want to shift our vocabulary quite a lot, and I think in a Harvard context, I really want to suggest we're going to dial it back. Lots of syllables back. And there's a reason for this, and it's a Krister Stendahl story as well. Krister was my mentor and teacher, and I think for all of us, usually about our second year here, I finished in 1980, the privilege to be in the course where Krister would teach you to preach was perhaps best referred to as a double-edged sword. Krister was an extraordinary preacher himself, but as he would say, Swedish. And that meant there wouldn't be so many words, not so many words of criticism, and there would be long looks. So many long looks, in fact, that one of our classmates, when it was his turn and he was first to give a demonstration sermon, got up and actually gave a whole pre-sermon about how nervous he was. And this absolutely floored Krister. He really had no intention of scaring us, but he did routinely, and he scared us. He scared us by the simplicity of what he did. So I want to tell you a tiny story on my very first day of the Divinity School, and then take you to what I think is inherent in, well, it's one of many inherencies in these papers. I promise not so many syllables. We were walking that first day. It was a day that New England often gives that was gray and rainy. And we were making our way through the bottom of this building over to Rockefeller Hall where we were going to eat. And I can't honestly tell you if it's still there, but there was at the time a storm drain. It had rained quite a lot. And we got to that drain, and it was just early enough in the fall that things had fallen a little bit, not so much, but they were blocking the drain. And there was a very large puddle. Krister was leading the way, and if you had paid attention to his outfits, and there were many amazing ones, this one was still a little bit referencing Nantucket, and he had his sandals on. He rolled his pant legs up, waded into the puddle, took his sandals off, waded into the puddle, cleared away the leaves. The water began to drain. He turned and looked back at us. We all followed along, much like those ducklings over by Boston. Later, he would apologize to us for the fact that our coursework at this place was going to get in the way of our work. And I have to tell you, I was terrified by that statement, because I thought surely somebody here knew what my work was. And if they would just lay it out for me in some course that I could take, I would figure it out and reasonably bright, turn in a few papers and move on my way. Listening to your papers today and having had the privilege of being in this spot once before, I'm struck all the time by something he always said at the beginning of that preaching class. He never wagged a finger at us, but he always said, "None of your little stories." He never explained fully what the big story was. We just knew that that was the one he thought we should keep our eyes for. Sometimes, if you pushed hard, he would say that the intersection he was looking for was whatever narrative we might be able to uncover, point to, shine a light on, that would somehow illumine some part of what he understood to be sacred narrative. For Krister, that was biblical preaching. He thought it was the only kind. But I thought as I listened to your papers in my study, and actually on an airplane, that in this place, it seems to me always, I'm hearing the scholarship of this place reaching for that larger narrative and trying to understand whether it's about the passage of a law that, frankly, as an ethicist for the hospice in Rhode Island, we thought was a slam dunk, and we wondered what was going to happen in Rhode Island if the Massachusetts law passed. Watching the cleverness of the reframing of that story by people with some religious money under them, but with the knowledge that they needed other allies. My question to all of you is, what's the story? And in Krister's language, let our research, our work, our polysyllabic, multiple claused, complex, adverbially nuanced paragraphs be about pointing to that story, the one that clears the leaves out of the puddle and makes it possible for, of course, we thought we were God's people, to pass over to Rockefeller with dry feet. But maybe some of you with Protestantism in your background know that language from an Easter hymn about the passage to righteousness, which leads you with unmoistened foot. I just have sung too many hymns. I couldn't walk over that dry pavement without thinking that this dean was somehow leading me on a much larger journey, a much larger story. And in all of our scholarship, in this endless work we do in universities, our job was to somehow, as each of you had pointed out in different ways, Molly, listening to this notion that the ontological status of perception and caring, I don't know what that means on the street. I think whenever I watch somebody talk about epistemology to first-year students at Brown, I see this glaze go over their eyes like, oh my goodness, the epistemic what? But it doesn't take very long before they're writing those words in their papers, right? And I don't know if it's just the cool vocabulary and the fun that it used to be when I too was very little and loved telling stories, not to video cameras, there weren't any then, but that narrativity that seems in us. While Krister was certainly trying to launch out of here people who would literally do as good a job as possible in the pulpits of the variety of traditions that people were coming from, and that was changing. In my Master of Divinity class, there were 28 of us. We were predominantly Protestant with a little flavoring of a few other traditions, and those people were very, very interesting to us as classmates. Look at this school now. At the time, the single largest population of people in the school, such as you could do demographics, which seem very important to me to some of these papers, you could find about 50% of the women in the school were Roman Catholic. And as my roommate at the time, Cheryl Giles, now your faculty member, would say, well, you know, if you can't get the Vatican's approval, Harvard might do. There's a fundamentally political idea in this storytelling. It does have to do with context. There's nothing simple about the telling of stories. So the questions of moving away from ventriloquism so that we're not simply parroting some story that isn't ours, or maybe to use a more rock and roll sort of idea, we're not just covering a song, but perhaps we've actually composed it. We're then moving into the performativity of it. What happens as we do that? Whose song is it? Was it framed in some highfalutin academic place, so that means perhaps it's not very singable by others? And then this notion of a collision of narratives, because whatever secularity might be about, it might be some agreement to try and coexist in some set physical space within a generation in relative, peace may be too much, but in relative calm, with some sort of procedural access. But then again, as soon as somebody says, well, you know, that law is a little blurry and it's not really written very well, and you know the narrative we all know, the world's inequitable. The world doesn't care about people with disabilities. If you're old, well, I know that story. I can tell that story with my eyes shut. If a law is going to tell another story of our secular moment, if it's going to be the process by which we're all going to live together, I not only am going to have to be conscious of who I am in the storytelling and what that process might produce in terms of passing a law, but do I not also have to be aware of what it produces in you, as in stark terror? Who are you going to kill next, and for what reason? Because the story of our lives as people together is one of violence. It is one of failing one another. It's not the one of the dean wading into the puddle to clear the path. It's the one of figuring out how not to ruin your clothes by getting soaked, or how to get some way around that water. So the themes you've raised in these papers seem to me to go to the heart of what this school is about. But I think they may go to the heart of what Krister, in a more preaching, limited context, was trying to point our eyes to in saying none of your little stories. Now, I will finish by telling you specifically what he meant. If you preach, you may be one of those people who goes out hoping for that cool joke or that great narrative example that you're going to open with. Krister felt often that the person leaving your worship service would remember that story and not the story that in his mind you were obliged to tell. And the story you were obliged to tell in his mind was the story of their dignity, of their worth, of the point of the created order being not about their little lives, because that was another thing he was on your case about, but about this larger shared life of the world, which was where this interfaith notion for him became so lively. When it was the dialogue that wasn't happening in great universities between Jews and Christians, and where the antipathy between those two traditions, really domestic violence in a way, intimate violence, a shared narrative that then gets broken, his sense that that had to be told differently really cuts to very core ideas that you've raised in these papers. But he wasn't squeamish about the fact that it also had to have a secular meaning. It had to have a day-to-day, leaf-clearing, law-passing, equitable meaning that would somehow resonate with those of us who were students, and frankly with a larger civic purpose that he imagined those who graduated from this place with all our erudition in many, many syllabled paragraphs would somehow be in service to. So I find myself back at this question of what's the story? Whose story is it? And what is it about stories? And then I guess finally with my wonderful friend who is a storyteller by profession, she always says, is the story true? And if it is, how do you know? And if it isn't, how did you pick that up? You've suggested, each of you, in different ways, in telling us a story of a law and how it passed, or in looking at this question of narrativity, or even this question of where is perception and where is, if I use the concept of care, Molly, I guess I get right into ethics because I spend a lot of my time there. But I wonder what the propulsive aspects of story are for animating that moment, whether it's simply to clear the puddle or it's actually to clear the path for a less aggressive ethic of death, which is actually implicit in much of what we now call medical care. And the story we don't tell about that, which allows me to say of that law, it's confusing. We have no narrative yet about how to die. And speaking as the next generation that's about to start doing all of that, while some of you younger than us watch on, we need that narrative. And that narrative has to be conscious of all of the ways in this country, and many we haven't even heard yet. We value life. We think it okay to open our hands and receive death. We imagine eternity. We think of life beginning again. And those narratives must, it seems to me, have a privileged place in a marvelous school like this. So it's been an honor to hear you guys wrestle with those perceptions and to hear these wonderful questions that Lucia's raised for us as well. I hope that our audience will join us in this conversation.
That they would like to bring up. And I'm sure our panelists would love to hear those questions and to respond to them. So if there are, I think Jason here has a microphone.
Maybe just a very short one here. It did seem to me that, Molly, you may have given undue short shrift to pragmatism, in the sense that William James is certainly not the person you portray him as being. In his marvelous, not often enough read essay on a certain blindness in human beings, James notes that we regularly have a radical misunderstanding of the perspectives and values of people whose life experience differs substantially from ours, and that the way you find out about those is, in fact, through dialogue and mutual storytelling.
I will respond to that by saying thank you very much. And what is the name of the essay?
On a certain blindness in human beings. It's from his from Talks for Teachers. I can't remember the full title of the collection.
Great, thank you.
We stumped them.
Well, maybe everybody is looking to head on to the reception, I suppose. But I think we should give everybody another hand. I just think it's been so fun.
Wonderful, wonderful.
And so great.